In countries where governments and infrastructure are strong, disputes can be resolved peacefully. However, in unstable areas, regional conflict can expand into international problems. The conflict in Darfur, which was originally based in problems with land resources and conflict between herders and farmers in that area, has now moved into China. Another problem is that countries with already existing problems will have those problems exacerbated by the types of issues we have mentioned: migration, the growth of terrorism, and the possibility of failed states, and this conflict over resources. Some countries and regions that already are experiencing water scarcities are Kuwait, Jordan, Israel, Rwanda, Somalia, Algeria, and Kenya, and those names should bring to mind a host of other existing issues. As these countries are all already unstable, they could be a hotbed for a number of issues, including terrorism, domestic and international conflict.
Let's talk a little bit about environmental security, which is defined as the intersection of environmental and national security considerations at a national policy level. Broken down, it has several key dimensions. So on the environmental side, we have human activity is increasingly understood as fundamentally affecting a number of basic global and regional physical, chemical, and biological systems in a process that, thanks to demographic and economic growth, is accelerating. On the economic side, this continuous evolution is marked by increasingly globalization, the rise of service and the knowledge-based economy, and a change in the patterns of work and the social contracts that previously linked firms with workers. Then on the geopolitical side, the end of the bipolar geopolitical Cold War structure with its defining conflict between capitalist and communist global ideologies has led to a more fragmented, complex world as previously submerged local and regional tensions emerge, often explosively. Now, taken together, some suggest that human societies are moving toward a globalized economy, a society that will no longer be homogeneous, but rather more complex in a technical sense. However, the critical barriers to such political evolution are frequently not economic, legal, or technical, but cultural. For example, consider the conflicts and misunderstandings that have arisen as the world's trading system, embodied in such entities as NAFTA or the World Trade Organization, struggles to combine free trade and environmental protection. Using trade in this way, however, strongly constrained by international law, which being based on the foundation of the absolute sovereignty of the national state, significantly limits the ability to impose one country's environmental constraints on another through trade. So, easily defined, the basic problem, even if an environmental perturbation may pose a significant threat to a national state, it may still not be a national security issue if it falls outside the competency and culture of the national security community and its component institutions. So as a solution, we want to define the concept better, making it both easier to implement and less contentious ideologically. We have renowned military expert General Zinni on the phone with us today. General Zinni, it's a pleasure to have you. If you could just talk a little bit about climate change and the effect that it will have on national security in the United States.
If you look at climate change and you look at their impacts, you then have to realize that those impacts can cause national security issues or concerns. I think you've seen the military responses in places like Bangladesh and several times over the last decade or so, and humanitarian intervention. But, you know, I think you could clearly look at there and see it's not only going to be a matter of land loss and the other problems that emerge. It's going to be problems, you know, such as water shortages, where entire aquifers disappear. We have large societies that are dependent upon glacier sources or sources that and aquifers that are drying up, and it doesn't take much to project forward and see when they'll reach disastrous proportions. And then what happens? Are we going to have water wars? Having been the commander of U.S. Central Command and familiar with the Middle East and Africa and even Central Asia, there are serious water concerns in those parts of the world now. And if there was a liquid that could cause war more than oil, it was certainly water in those places. Well, what we saw in the relationship to terrorism, and I would even broaden it to non-state entities that such as drug cartels, warlords, organized international criminal organizations, terrorist groups, etc. Many of these groups, in order to survive, need unstable societies that don't have the security forces and the level of governance that can counter their impact. And so that's why the Al-Qaedas of the world search out the Afghanistans or the Somalias to operate in. And the more failed or incapable states you have, or failed or incapable societies that have been reduced to that unstable state because of environmental conditions, the more likely that in that sort of degraded situation, these kinds of groups will find sanctuary. I also think when you look at some conditions, for example, like the melting of the ice cap in the Arctic, we now have a sea that could become a transportable sea. What are the implications of that? How do we protect our interests there, promote our interests, prevent it from being threatened? People will rush there, obviously, nations to acquire the resources, to use it as a means of transit, and just like the Atlantic or the Pacific or other major seaways, there's a security issue involved in that. So those are some examples of how the impacts could flow over into national security concerns. Look at mitigating the conditions that are worsened by release of greenhouse gases, then the impacts would be more severe, and then it logically follows that the security concerns or issues that will arise will be more severe. So we can help mitigate that now. It's not a matter of, well, geez, I don't want to spend the resources now. I can worry about this later. You will spend them later, probably in greater amounts, and the conditions will be much worse. So it's an investment. It's almost like an insurance policy on what you could do to reduce these effects now. And my advice would be to any leader representing us in these international conferences on this is as a leader of the free world, to set the example, to look at how we can best reduce release of greenhouse gases, and at the same time to work with the international community, bring pressure on others like China and India that are not signatories to Kyoto and other arrangements that cause them to do likewise. It's a small planet. The effects of this will know no borders. And it's important for us to find common ground on this as best we can. If we worry about the immediate economic impact, that may be just a short-term advantage, and the longer term will be much more expensive down the road, not only to our economy, but to our security interests and to the welfare of our population as well as others. So the basic, recommendations are to be good stewards of the environment, do what you can within the military to limit the problems that may be generated from training exercises and equipment. Secondly, understand the problem, use your intelligence resources and study of how these things can cause emerging security problems. And then third, do the planning and the preparation necessary should these things arise. What you do now, even if these impacts are 30 years off, I happen to believe they're not that far, but even if they are that far off, why would you not want to do things to lessen the severity of it by taking actions now and adjusting to it? There are some things you can see right now. You can see the ice melting in the Arctic. You can see the Arctic becoming a transportable sea. You can see many nations rushing to the Arctic to exploit its resources out there. You can see that those things all generate security concerns and issues. So to put your head into the sand and say it's 30 years off, don't worry about it now, will allow you to be unprepared when the time comes and maybe make the situation worse because of the actions you don't take in the interim. So I don't think it's alarmist to emerge from a group like ours. I think it should get some attention.
There are two eras of environmental policy in the United States, starting in the 1960s and lasting through the 1980s, encompassing the environmental decade of the 1970s. In the 1990s, you saw a resurgence of the environmental policy after the Reagan administration. What you saw was that Americans and other countries in the world realized that it wasn't going to just take one government to solve the problems of environmental policy. Americans realized, as well as activists, started looking at industrialization and the effect that it had on the United States. Basically, environmental policy is not the problem of just too many people. It's a problem of conformity of consumption and lifestyles.